Sheila Prashtika, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, but I suppose even to stop right there, just with that short, simple, standard salutation, ladies and gentlemen, you already see the depth of the problem of stereotyping we are inured in by custom. Why ladies first? Why not gentlemen? And why, in a respectably run summer school, is the poisoned perfume of courtliness allowed to mask the absence of real equality? Gentlemen and ladies, as the sole survivor of the original panel to speak here at this debate this evening, albeit on a different topic, my thoughts turn to Ted Heath, when Joe Mulholland called me and asked me not to join the exodus of the indignant. A famous, or rather infamous, front page of Private Eye in the 1970s featured Ted, and the bubble out of his mouth said, "If you want a woman, I'm your man." I didn't have to check my mediocrity to know that if I was the last man standing tonight, the final vestiges of male denomination would come to an ignominious end. But thankfully, Peter Cosgrove is here to share in the humiliation with me. It's an interesting thing about gender stereotyping, but some of the umbrage about it contains the DNA of the virus itself. The reaction in advance of MacGill was flavoured by ageism. To understand what we speak of, we must attempt to answer the question of what gender stereotyping is. How deep does it run? I think it runs very deep indeed, and I will not mince my words. In our Western culture, you have to go back to ancient Greece, and in particular to Aristotle's biological writings, which were the main source of the consideration of women as the weaker sex. And he wrote, "The female also is more subject to depression of spirits and despair than the male. She is also more shameless and false, more readily deceived, and more mindful of injury, more watchful, more idle, and on the whole less excitable than the male." And curiously, and I'm not exactly sure what Aristotle's experience of women were, but he also wrote that they had fewer teeth than men. In his Politics, he opined that the relationship of male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled. And Plato, in his Republic, had already written that women and men have the same nature in respect of the guardianship of the state, insofar as one is weaker and the other is stronger. And these views were echoed by St. Paul, by the early church fathers, by St. Thomas Aquinas. They are the scaffolding of Western thought, and they are still a living basis for some of our attitudes. And no matter how we parse the debate, these views gain dominance not only in the West, but also in the Islamic world, as the work of Aristotle was rediscovered and gained enormous credence, even canonical status. Dante called him the master of those who know. And Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, wrote, "It was necessary for women to be made, as the scripture says, as a helper to man, not indeed as a helpmate in other works, as some say, since man can be more efficiently helped by another man in other works, but as a helper in the work of generation." So woman as mother, not as equal, as someone biologically inferior, as psychologically suspect, is deeply ingrained in our culture over thousands of years. The philosopher, as I said, that Aquinas based much of his work on was Aristotle, and who he commented on many of these texts. But it was the revival of Thomism, the said Thomas Aquinas, in the 19th century by French Dominicans, which led to an enormous revival of his intellectual framework in the Catholic world particularly, but also in wider society. For example, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception was only declared infallible in 1854, the Assumption in 1950. And these may seem another era now, and in some respects they are, but inculcation remains long after outward forms have vanished. We may laugh a little nervously now, but science was the means by which women were defined out of subjectivity. Women were imagined as impossible biological phenomena, such as goddesses and virgin mothers. Woman gained her place and definition through motherhood. That was her highest social role. And as the song says, and there's an excellent version by Tommy Makem, it's oh dear me, how would it be if I died an old maid in a garret? And people in this room remember that song, have sung it. And this is all where it comes from. So it's in the air, it's in the atmosphere, it's all around us, it's soaked in. It may be ancient, but it doesn't mean it's not current or it still doesn't survive. And gender stereotyping is not just crass prejudice. It is not simply mythical male violence. It is biology, it is philosophy, it is law, it is cultured, and it has naturalized the idea of what is appropriate or supposedly appropriate for men and women, and it still finds transmission routes today. Nobody sat down with us, or at least with me as children, to state all this like that, but even in my childhood, there was a residue of all this in the segregation of sexes at school, in the segregation of sexes through schooling, in the notion of natural capabilities belonging to male and female. In school and secondary school in the late 70s and the early 80s, woodwork was for boys, domestic science was for girls, and I could go on, and that's very recent, and I don't believe it's entirely gone away. And founded on old systems with an extraordinary capacity to regenerate, those ideas ironically mutated again through the truth of science. The Darwinian ideal of the survival of the fittest is the ethos of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of white populations, including white women, feeling threatened by immigration. And aging populations and depopulation means that the issue of women as childbearers is still here as a potent political issue. You don't have to listen to a lot of country and Western music to know that the message is stand by your man. In the context of Donald Trump and the consequence of his election, Hillary Clinton's ironic use of that line 24 years before contributed to her lack of credibility in 2016. She couldn't beat Donald Trump because she couldn't compete with Tammy Wynette. Women did vote for Clinton, but white women helped elect Trump. Overall, 54% of women voted for Clinton, but it was black women who drove that figure up because 64% of non-college educated white women voted for Trump. Only 35% supported Clinton. And as Wynette so sorrowfully sung, sometimes it's hard to be a woman. Gender stereotyping, which exists in the Irish Constitution, can as easily be seen in popular culture, and in Hollywood particularly, as it can, for example, in the Assumption, body and soul of the Blessed Virgin into heaven. The golden age of both, incidentally, was in the 1950s. We were raised on cinema where the woman was rescued by the man. Tarzan, King Kong, Gone with the Wind. They may be very camp outliers of cinema now, but it was a Trump, not a Hillary world on screen. Hollywood loved Hillary, but its product over generations was largely toxic for her cause. It is Trump, not Reagan, who is really the first working actor in the White House, and he is playing his role to stereotype. The role of Darwin can be as detrimental, I think, as that of Aristotle or Aquinas. with its right is might, survival of the fittest idea, taken as permission for extreme political actions, as has happened, and social Darwinism, science without boundaries, in a world where God is dead, has been the root of unspeakable evil. Always vigilance is required, and science must be constantly interrogated. An enabling agency for women or others does not automatically bring us or arrive at equality. To see the issue of gender, I think Sheila has intimated, without interrogating class, ageism, race, simply adjusts inequality instead of addressing it. And watching the too slow acquisition of decency for women, I'm aware of the continuing deep resistance to difference and to others. Who outsiders are changes, but the fact of a need to other because of gender, age, class, or colour remains strong. There is neither the civility or the self-confidence required to embrace difference and understand it makes us equal. To displace the cock at the top of the dunghill, to simply replace him with another creature, is to revisit George Orwell's Animal Farm. You cannot speak of equality unless you speak of class. You cannot speak of gender stereotyping among the university educated and the very relatively well-heeled, except as a parody. Where on public platforms are men or women on the minimum wage? Where in our public conversation are men or women without a university education? In 2,000 years, our gender stereotyping of women has adjusted slightly from mother, nurse, wife, and mistress to mother, nurse, wife, mistress, and CEO. It's not a huge amount of progress because it replaces one impossibility or virtual impossibility for most with another. And from Aquinas and Aristotle, we have pivoted to Darwin and to Bill Gates. We live in a Microsoft world. We have changed the software, but the hard drive remains very impervious and very consistent. And I look forward to an Ireland where inherited stereotypes are over. I want an Ireland where there are an equal number of women working on our bin lorries and in our boardrooms. I want women on building sites as well as sitting in the chairs of our academy and our universities. And I look forward to voting to remove Article 41(2) of the Constitution, which recognises that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. And I want a reimagining of our culture afterwards to ensure that the gender stereotypical payment of child benefit ceases to be paid to women alone, because we recognise that men are capable of nurture and should be hoisted with the responsibility of nurture. I want to see our pension system reformed so that older women particularly have access to decent pensions as well, and are not in the trap of a significantly greater degree of poverty in old age than men. And I want to grow old in an Ireland where being old and male is not a synonym for stale. Do we really have an appetite for changing gender stereotypes on this scale? Is this debate and the row that preceded it all about agency, or is it genuinely about equality? Do we understand the scale of change required to deliver real equality of opportunity? If it is simply about replacing the male, the pale, and the stale, the victory will be easy, but it will be Pyrrhic. I put it to you, gentlemen and ladies, that organisations such as MacGill are still trapped in a world of gender stereotypes because we as a country have never actually considered the consequences of our aspirations. Thank you very much.